Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's IMechE webinar. The topic is pathways and barriers to electrification of the energy supply. The presenter is Dr. John Massey. John is one of our renowned trainers here at the IMechE. He's going to present for around about 45 minutes on the topic. There will be around 15 minutes as an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, if you could put those into the chat box, and then we'll be able to answer those at the end of the presentation. The presentation will also be recorded, the slides can be provided, and the presentation will be on our YouTube channel, and further information on all the courses in this topic can also be found on the website. But I'll hand over to John now, so I appreciate that time is running short, and I'll hand over to John.
Okay, thanks, Darren. Welcome everybody. As mentioned, there's a few slides to go through. I'll try and rattle through the slides reasonably quickly to allow plenty of time at the end to answer any questions that you've got. What I briefly want to talk about today, electrification. It's a topic that comes up quite a lot. It's a key pillar of a lot of the pathways towards kind of net zero energy transition, whatever kind of terminology you want to apply for that. So I was going to briefly explain why, kind of what the rationale behind electrification is, kind of why it kind of features, and in the case of some of the scenarios, kind of where it fits into some of those net zero scenarios, and then of course highlight some of the challenges with it, some of the problems in achieving a kind of fully electrified universe and whether that's even kind of possible. So highlight some of those, and of course with that some of the options and some of the technologies that not individually, but I think an important part of this is kind of what some of the technologies which might fit together to achieve, if not full electrification, and at least help electrification happen. I'm very much of the opinion that whereas a lot of the time these things are presented as different pathways that kind of directly compete with each other, I think a lot of the stuff that's talked about as competing with electrification is actually able to enable further electrification. So I'll kind of get to that as we go along. So if I can find my cursor, there we go. So this idea of kind of, if you like, pure electrification, as I've termed it here, there are people out there that kind of say electrify everything, and electrify everything. Generally, what that is supposed to look like is we have some clean power supply, and we have a grid, of course, which we already got, but we'll certainly need to expand. And then, of course, we drive around in electric vehicles or on electric buses with freight delivered by electric trucks and so on. And we heat our homes with heat pumps. And of course, electrification also is happening at the same time as other key trends. So, for example, the increasing coexistence of centralized generation technology with home generation technology or distributed generation technology. So, not only can we have big utility scale wind farms, solar farms, hydro schemes, whatever else it might be, combined with utility scale storage to smooth out some of the variability. We'll touch on that as we go through this session. But of course, we can now also potentially generate electricity at the edge of the network, close to where it's being utilized, in some cases right at the edge of the network, or certainly within potentially distribution parts of the network and so on. And of course, increasingly, we can also store that. So you can have a solar panels on your rooftop, you can have a battery in your utility room or wherever it fits. On a domestic scale, also lots of that happening at commercial scale and so on as well. And in future, of course, the car that we're driving around is effectively a battery on wheels. So as far as the grid is concerned, when it's plugged in, we've got another big source of storage there. So hence some of these arrows start to go in two directions. We've gone from a grid where it was all centralized power generation pushing out to potentially a grid system where things at the edge of the network can now start to interact with the center in both directions. So that's kind of idealized, looks quite nice. Why kind of head down that route? So I think one important aspect of electrification, which is probably not mentioned as much as I think it should be, is simply electrification as a form of energy efficiency almost. So the one at the bottom, the graphic at the bottom, comes out of a Volkswagen publication. And it's basically making the point that if we're talking about, for example, take electrification of transport as an example, if we start off with renewable electricity at one end, we don't lose much of it into what goes into the wheels. If we're going to lose a little bit in the grid, a little bit in storage within the grid potentially, and in the charging point, the round trip of efficiency of a battery is not 100%, so we'll lose a little bit in the battery. The motors themselves, of course, are not 100% efficient, but certainly the vast majority of the electricity we started with is going to go into driving the wheels. I think 90% is pushing, being a bit wildly optimistic, but certainly 70% or thereabouts of what you started with 1,000 kilometers away or wherever in your wind farm should end up in driving the wheels of your car. That's completely different to a conventional vehicle, for example. That quote comes from the US Department of Energy, where and this is talking about that's not even the full supply chain. That's just saying that if you've got a tank full of what I would call petrol, what they would call gasoline, only at best kind of 20 to 30% of that is actually going to go into spinning the wheels of the car. And of course, if you went further back in the supply chain, you've got energy associated with getting it out of the ground, refining it. Refining is quite a big source of energy use. You've got those stats about something like 40% of shipping in the world is moving fossil fuels around. So you've got all the kind of efficiencies along those supply chains as well. And that's kind of an important point, because a lot of energy stats, for example, use this kind of thing. They talk about primary energy. So this was out of the last kind of BP review. BP very helpfully for the last kind of however many years have produced kind of stats around energy every year. And this is their graph, the last one, of what they call primary energy use. And it shows, and this is global figures, so it shows global energy use going up, little dips for the financial crash back here, another dip for COVID, and then very quick recovery. And lots of people look at these charts and make the point that most of this, these are fossil. Most of that's fossil. So you've got oil, natural gas, and coal, the green, red, and grey. So 80% or whatever of primary energy still is fossil energy, even with the rise of renewables and nuclear and other bits and pieces. But of course, that's what they're measuring there. This is when people talk about primary energy, not final energy. They're talking about the energy in the fuel. And so to go back to our car analogy, of that oil, all this green at the bottom, given that a big chunk of that is going into transport, the chunk of that that's going into transport, a pretty small amount of it is actually going into turning the wheels of our car. And actually, when you look at charts like this, when they talk about primary energy, nuclear, renewables, hydro, it's not a like for like comparison really, because the data they've got there is the electricity coming from those things. They're not talking about the amount of primary sunshine hitting the earth or the amount of primary wind blowing around. So of the stuff at the top in an electrified world, most of that should go to doing something useful at the far end. In the current picture of this oil, and the same is true of natural gas in power plants in particular, of coal in power plants, most of that fossil fuel, most of that primary energy, we set fire to it, it produces emissions, it produces CO2, we've got to pay for it, but it doesn't actually do anything useful. Most of it heats the sky. So that's an important factor, and that's why in charts like this one, this was the International Energy Agency, one of their scenarios about how you could get to net zero by 2050. It's not, they certainly wouldn't, they'd be very clear about claiming it's not a forecast of what's going to happen, but it's if you set it, if that's your aim, you want to get to net zero by 2050, again, globally, this is how you could do it. This is one scenario to get there. And you'll notice that electrification is a fairly big chunk on its own. And people sometimes get confused when I show this chart. They say, well, you've got electrification, but you've also got things like wind and solar on here. Is that not the same thing? And it's not, because the electrification here is simply that reduction in emissions simply by reducing the usage of fossil fuels, and hence reducing those emissions that are just not doing anything useful with. So simply by going from fossil fuel usage to electrification, that kind of end-to-end efficiency saving in itself is going to mean a big reductions in emissions. And then, of course, the trick is, if you're going to do electrification, you need to make sure it's clean electrification. That's where your sources of electricity come in. That's where your wind and solar comes in, or hydro, or geothermal, or whatever your kind of favorite type of power generation is, or potentially, and they've got a big chunk of that on here, continuing to use fossil fuels, but capturing the carbon that comes from them. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later on. So that's an important point about electrification. People often kind of miss that chunk of it in the context of particularly decarbonisation, just that energy efficiency aspect to it, just a more efficient use of the energy that we've collected in the first place. Combine that with decarbonisation, and in some places, UK, we've been pretty good at doing that. So this is the carbon intensity, CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity generated over the past, well, however many years that graph covers. And certainly since kind of 2007, 2008, we've seen a reduction in carbon emissions, and particularly in the period from kind of 2010 through to 2020, really quite a steep reduction in carbon emissions associated with electricity generation. So, and that, of course, is a big part of the premise around electrification, is that because we've been doing better at decarbonising electricity than decarbonising fuels and heating in particular, a good approach to decarbonisation is going to be to keep decarbonising electricity and use electricity to replace fuel usage in those other applications, those other energy sectors. So aside from, there's the kind of overall energy efficiency side of it, which also plays into the decarbonisation side of it. And so in the UK, we've done that in particular by getting rid of coal, the kind of dark grey stuff here. I know you get headlines every now and again on a cold night over the winter that says coal's making a comeback because it's because the national grid have kind of had backup. They've called on some of their backup capacity coal plants to kind of fire up and get ready just in case. But the reality of that situation is that coal is pretty much gone from the UK system, which has been a big reason why those carbon emissions have gone down. We've also seen growth of wind in the red, particularly. You can see that kind of wedge has got quite a bit bigger. Solar to a less extent, because the UK is not the sunniest place in the world. But gas is still there. So if we were looking at that and saying, how can we take that previous chart and kind of keep going? And in fact, you can sort of see a little bit, we've stalled a little bit here in terms of carbon reduction, because we can't, the easy stuff, if you like, in the way of coal has gone. So if we want to go for full electrification and full decarbonised electrification, then the big question is, how do we get rid of the gas part in our electricity system? And so that's where it gets challenging, of course, because now we are back to pure electrification. We can identify, well, a few problems, but two big ones, of course, are one is variability. The wind doesn't always blow when we want it to. doesn't necessarily match demand. And the other one that is increasingly a major problem, not just in the UK, but globally, is the grid. If we're going to need to generate more electricity at one end to be able to increase electricity demand at the other end by doing more things with electricity, we need to be able to get it from A to B. If we're not generating it on our own rooftop, we're going to need more grid, or we're going to use the grid more effectively, more efficiently. There are some clever things we can do in terms of cramming more of the energy we produce through the existing grid, but fundamentally we're going to also need more grid. So variability, you've probably all seen charts a bit like this one. So this was a year ago. This is last March, the days of the month on the bottom, wind output on the y-axis. And at the start of the month, so round about nowish, there was quite a windy week. At the end of the month, there was a very non-windy week. Just as a thought experiment, if you wanted to kind of fill up the non-windy area over here up to that green line, you would need about 580,000 megawatt hours of electricity. And the difference between the kind of green line and the lowest point on the blue line is about 4.3 gigawatts. And so maybe you could do that by storing electricity when it was windy over here. So the same, the green line and up above that, it's basically, as a thought experiment, moving the same amount of electricity from the start of the month to the end of the month. And so those kind of numbers are worth kind of holding in our head, particularly the energy quantity we're talking about there, 580,000 megawatt hours or 580 gigawatt hours worth of energy. So storage is going to be a challenge. Can we store that? I mean, for context, the biggest battery systems in the world these days are around about kind of 200 or 300 megawatts and getting up to, I think there's some at kind of 1200 up to 1500 megawatt hours in parts of the States, and some big ones coming on stream in Australia. But 1500 megawatt hours, and I think that would be pretty much the biggest battery system anywhere in the world at the moment. You'd need an awful lot of those to add up to that 580,000 megawatts, and that's just for that kind of 1 week. If we need to be able to, if that's going to be the answer to variability, and it may not, of course, be the answer to variability, as we'll see. Curtailment. We're also in the UK. We see curtailment again. The papers are normally quite keen and gleefully talking about curtailment of wind every now and again. Germany sees curtailment, China sees curtailment, California. This is mainly solar in California, and you can see that curtailment has been growing over the years. Now, curtailment can be because you've got so much supply that you've not got enough demand for it, but that's unusual. Curtailment is normally about grid capacity. It's normally that it's not that there's not someone somewhere who would want to use that electricity, it's that you can't get it from where you're producing it. In the UK, that would be, for example, wind up in the wilds of Scotland, and people wanting to use it down here in the southeast, but there's simply not enough grid capacity to get to connect the two. And curtailment obviously is problematic because you tell that wind farm to turn off even where it could be producing, and given the kind of regulatory environment, there's almost certainly still getting constraint payments for that. And of course, you still need the electricity somewhere further south. So another plant, probably a gas plant somewhere, turns up to provide that electricity. So, but grid is a big bottleneck. Again, this was kind of a UK headline very recently, talking about kind of projects in the pipeline. There was a headline just the other day that I saw that was some enormous amount. We're talking kind of 100 plus gigawatts of potential solar wind projects that were stuck in some kind of connection delay situation and couldn't kind of move forward. And that's not just a UK problem. There are frighteningly large interconnection queues in the US. again, elsewhere, and the same in Europe. Plenty of countries around the world. We're not the only place in the world where grid capacity has not been keeping up with installation of generating capacity. And one of the reasons for that is not just the grid as a bottleneck, but the public as a bottleneck. There are people are often very keen on the idea of green energy and cleaner grids and that kind of stuff, right up to the point where you tell them that there's going to be some pylons that need to carry it on the other side of their fence. Or even with underground cabling, there's going to be trenches dug through fields and that kind of stuff. So this was a headline. This was in the east of England. There are lots of issues in East Anglia at the moment about the need for transmission capacity, in particular for the big growth already and planned further forward for offshore wind in the North Sea. That electricity is going to have to come on land. It's going to have to get from where it arrives up the beach to the main kind of population and demand centres where it's going to be used. That is not going to fit into the existing grid. There's going to have to be more network built. And of course, if you can't build that network, that becomes a barrier, not just to electrification, but a barrier to just kind of cleaning up the electricity grid in the first place. So variability is an issue, grid is an issue. To some extent, both of those things can start to be solved by storage. So storage is clearly going to be an essential technology to handle that kind of shift. Here were some numbers. This was some recent numbers from Bloomberg around battery growth forecasts, and so they reckon that by 2020, we're kind of down here currently. I mean, the growth forecasts are enormous for this is global growth of batteries, and they tend to get bigger each time. It's one of those sets of forecasts where each year the new forecast comes out, it tends to be larger than the last one, driven by reductions in battery costs. Although in the last year they've actually edged upwards slightly, but long-term trend towards lower battery costs. But again, it's the scale of the numbers that are interesting here. So they're forecasting that by 2030, you'll have about 1,200 gigawatt hours of total global battery capacity. I think from my slide a little bit earlier on, just on that week of wind in the UK, that was kind of 600 megawatt hours. So that was 600,000 megawatt hours. So that was kind of 600 gigawatt hours. So you kind of need half of that global capacity to soak up that wind. Also cost batteries. I mean, battery packs nowadays, the costs have come down enormously over the last kind of 5 years, even certainly over the last 10 years. Packs are kind of somewhere a little bit above $100 per kilowatt hour, that kind of order of magnitude. Obviously, the project itself costs more than that because there's other bits than just the battery pack. But even if we looked at battery packs, $100 per kilowatt hour, if we're saying we need for that week of wind in the UK, we need 600,000 megawatt hours, so 600 million kilowatt hours multiplied by another 100. Whatever, I'm kind of losing track of the noughts a bit, but if my numbers are right, whatever that is, $60 billion. You get into kind of extremely insane numbers when we start to talk about certainly current battery technology. But what I would always point out to people when they kind of throw their hands up and say, well, it can't be done, and based on current battery technology, there is lots and lots of new battery technology coming along. There are there's a company called Form Energy, for example, who have just signed agreements. They've been in. They appeared kind of a couple of years ago as a kind of startup, not saying much about what they were doing, and then recently they've started signing some projects with utilities to do first demonstration projects of battery systems, which at least they claim are going to have much longer durations. and at much cheaper costs because of much cheaper materials. So I mean, these claims are about 10 times cheaper, and I mean, obviously treat those claims with large buckets of salt to begin with, but they're not the only one out there. There's people often, I think people are underestimating what is happening in the battery world. If as soon as people start complaining about we'll run out of lithium, it's worth pointing out that the first sodium-ion batteries have started to be commercialized. We're certainly not going to run out of sodium. I would argue we're not going to run out of lithium either. It's not particularly uncommon supply, but we'll come back to that. Minerals will come up shortly. But I don't think anyone is seriously suggesting that you're going to do all that. You're going to be able to solve all that kind of storage, all that long-term, huge-scale storage that you would need in a fully electrified system, simply by stacking up shipping containers full of batteries. Whatever happens with the technology. And so that brings us to other alternatives, of course. That's where solutions like hydrogen are being talked about. As a hydrogen currently is an industrial chemical. That's an important thing to say right up front. Hydrogen at the moment is not a player in the world of energy. It's also not clean. Most hydrogen is produced from natural gas. Another big chunk of it is produced from coal, and lots of emissions associated with it. But if we can scale up clean hydrogen production, one good thing about hydrogen is we know we can. It's a gas. It's a fuel. We've now got a more kind of physical fuel, if you like, if that even is a meaningful statement. And it's one that we know we can store on a big scale. And we know we can store it on a big scale because there are currently 4 big salt cavern storage projects already operating. The one in Teesside has been operating since 1976 or something. The ones here in Texas are a bit more recent, over the last kind of 10, 15 years. Can't remember exactly the start dates of those. But they are storing pretty sizable amounts. So 27,000 megawatts in the case of Teesside. So that's energy content, at least in the hydrogen. Not going to get all that back if you turn it to electricity, but into hundreds of gigawatt hours when we look at the biggest. I think it's probably the Moss Bluff one, the biggest of the Texan capacities. And so that's leading into the idea that if we start off with pure electrification, if this battery bit is a problem, if we need more storage, then we can convert some of our primary electricity, if you like, our primary clean electricity supply. If we turn some of that into a clean fuel, and it could be hydrogen, but there's also a whole other subject, is lots and lots of around derivatives of hydrogen, turning hydrogen into ammonia, or turning hydrogen into putting it into other forms which are easier to store. But for the moment, you kind of read all that as producing hydrogen to start with, at least. We can store hydrogen potentially on a bigger scale than we can store battery, a bigger scale more economically than we can do by stacking up shipping containers full of batteries. And we can potentially put that through a power plant which in future is able to run on hydrogen. So a conventional kind of a thermal turbine generator plant, but one which is kind of hydrogen capable, and we can turn it back to electricity. And the round trip efficiency, again, people will throw their hands up and say, well, that's got horrible round trip efficiency. But again, there will be some situations where round trip efficiency has to take second fiddle to the fact you can actually practically do something. Economics is not just about round trip efficiency. So if you can do it short duration storage with a battery, that will account for a lot of the variability that needs to be solved. Things like solar, for example, kind of just more like daily cycles. That's much easier. But there'll be some things where if you need very long duration storage, it might be more efficient kind of thermodynamically to do it with a battery, but it's much more expensive than doing it with hydrogen, even with a lower efficiency. And of course, the other thing that hydrogen offers is there's no kind of law of physics that says you have to turn it back to electricity. So you can potentially use hydrogen as hydrogen. You can potentially now have fuel cell vehicles, fuel cell big heavy vehicles, for example. You can, again, either as hydrogen or potentially more likely as things made from hydrogen, turn it into things like synthetic aviation fuel. So you can start to decarbonize other areas of transport, which might be hard to do with without. And of course, we can now add chemistry onto this. We can we can also potentially start off with our clean electricity, and in using that to produce hydrogen by splitting it out of water, we've now crossing sectors. We're actually going beyond just the energy sector and using some of that primary clean electricity that to clean up chemicals, clean up some of the chemistry world, anything from refining activities and ammonia production that currently happen, big users of hydrogen, but in future, potentially other things as well. And so as per the title, I would kind of think about this as it's not, a lot of people wouldn't count, they kind of start to not think about this as electrification because there's now kind of this kind of pesky gas has suddenly appeared in the middle of it. It's not kind of pure, it's not the kind of pure ideological definition of electrification maybe, but I would call this electrification but including hydrogen, because the primary starting point is electricity. We're not starting off with any fossil fuels here. Hydrogen here is being used as an enabler for electrification, as far as I'm concerned. If we have other ways to store, if we have other ways to address variability and maybe even bypass the grid by distributing hydrogen as hydrogen into other applications and maybe reduce some of those grid problems. It's not, fuel cell vehicles are still, they're still electric vehicles. It's just it's just that the electricity is now being made on board the vehicle rather than being made somewhere else and carried to the grid. So I kind of tend to refer to this as electrification, including hydrogen. Hydrogen as an enabler, certainly as an enabler for more renewable power and an enabler for more decarbonisation. And I count that as part of the kind of electrification world. We've still not got any of those fossil fuels with the kind of wasted primary energy and emissions that are associated with that. So that would be kind of if you can't do your perfect view of everything being electrified, maybe everything starts with clean electricity, but how it happens within the kind of midstream and then the downstream, the end use side of it, maybe partly that's full electrification, but partly it's kind of electrification via hydrogen, or even I guess at the end use side, say some of that wouldn't be electrification if it's synthetic aviation fuels going into aircraft in future. The end use is obviously not electrified, but again, I think that's where the boundaries get a bit blurred in terms of what we mean. I'm not going to get too bogged down in terminology. There are some other issues though that people raise. Minerals comes up an awful lot. This was out of an International Energy Agency study a couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago, I think it came out, where they were pointing out, as many people have, that things like electric cars, for example, compared to conventional cars, require a lot of stuff. We don't need to drill for oil, but we do need to mine for various type of minerals. Now, some of these are obviously quite controversial, like cobalt here in the light blue. Although increasingly there is a trend towards there's certainly been a trend toward decreasing cobalt, and there are a growing number of batteries now that don't have cobalt in at all. So again, if we start to home in too much on specific minerals, one thing I think you'd have to be aware of is that technology, if things get very scarce, technology tends to find a way of kind of bypassing them and using different things. That could be cobalt. It could be replacing using sodium rather than lithium, and so on and so on. But there are also some fundamental things like copper, and such like, just for kind of transporting electricity about. Similarly, for power generation, all our kind of nice wind power and solar power, they use more stuff. There's more mined minerals than there are with our fossil fuels. There's still an awful lot of mining goes on, of course, with coal. I mean, coal is mineral mining. And if you look at the scale of coal and the actual, again, I've seen some charts where the total amount of mining that happens for coal kind of dwarfs a lot of this other stuff that people are concerned about, and dwarfs it even with future growth factored in. And again, I would come back to the point that we mine all that coal out of kind of out of the ground. Again, often not in very nice conditions, and not very nice kind of labour conditions. And of course, the difference with coal is we mine it out of the ground, we set fire to it, we don't use most of the energy in it, and we can't get it back because then it's CO2 in the atmosphere. At least with these other minerals, we can recycle them. We could start to build those into a circular economy model. So again, and that will, whether how much of that happens is largely it's less of a function of technology. Again, I hear lots of people saying, well, you can't recycle lithium-ion batteries. You can. There are plenty of companies out there that can recycle high percentages, kind of 80% of lithium-ion batteries already. Those numbers will certainly go up. It's a question of economics, whether it's cheaper to recycle or to start from scratch. And also, I would say it's particularly going to be a question of regulation as to whether companies are forced to do that. So, but at least that possibility exists. We can't recycle oil and coal and natural gas because we set fire to them and they've gone. Whereas things in a battery or things in a solar panel or a turbine or whatever, at least end of life, you have the possibility to get those materials back rather than mine more out of the ground. But again, that doesn't escape the fact that there is going to be a shift from, if as we kind of progress through this transition, there will be a shift from what I've called kind of drilling to mining. And of course, the other aspect of this whole minerals and mining issue is not just even the extraction side of it, but the whole kind of supply chain bit of it, and resource security. So we've used to living in a world where geopolitics was dominated by who has oil, who has gas. Now are we just shifting into a world which is dominated by who has lithium, who has rare earth elements, and so on. The actual raw materials themselves, where these things exist, are pretty wide. There's reasonably wide spreads. Often we hear a lot about kind of China dominating this. China dominates rare earths, but it doesn't actually dominate some of the other key elements. What China does dominate at the moment is the processing of these things, taking those raw materials and processing them into forms that are then used in the end products. And of course, China also dominates a lot of the manufacturing of those end products. And so there's an awful lot going on at the moment, certainly in the States through the Inflation Reduction Act, but also now in Europe and here in the UK, on addressing and at least starting to think about to what extent you can be resource secure in that future world, or who your partners should be. Again, there's talk about what's the term, instead of outsourcing, friend sourcing, those kind of terms, where instead of just outsourcing manufacturing to the cheapest place and then finding out they're not particularly helpful, not in the long run from a geopolitical point of view, outsourcing to, if you can't do everything yourself, but at least then outsourcing to countries which you think are in your same kind of, I don't know, sphere of thinking or whatever you want to talk about. So, but certainly that's becoming an increasing part of the whole discussion. It would be foolish to ignore that because it's simply a fact. And of course, if we start to, even if in the long run, a lot of the limits that people talk about, I think, are more that are not, they're not necessarily theoretically there. You can overcome those just by more exploration and so on. From a practical point of view, that also does come back to the idea of, well, maybe we do need to stick with, maybe we can't phase out fossil fuels entirely quite so quickly. Maybe we can't go for that full electrification quite so quickly. And there are various options there, of course. And these, there's a couple of projects announced, at least. Obviously, no financial investment decisions or anything like that. But it was an interesting announcement because at the same time there were two projects. One was the idea of hydrogen again. So that's kind of hydrogen powered gas turbine. But in this case, with the hydrogen produced from what we call blue hydrogen produced from natural gas. So carry on drilling natural gas out the ground, strip the carbon out of it, carbon dioxide out of it first, and then what you've got left with is hydrogen. When you burn the hydrogen, you've not got to worry about emissions. And of course, the other approach is, if you've drilled your natural gas out the ground, just keep burning natural gas, but then add carbon capture onto it as a post-combustion thing. And so there's lots of discussion about which of the best pathways there is. There is what's called the dispatchable business model, I think it's called, which was announced kind of the end. Well, it was announced early last year, and it was kind of finalised in December of last year in the UK. So there will be support, there will be subsidy for gas power plants with carbon capture and storage. There will also be subsidy for blue hydrogen. We'll find out more about that this year, I think. There will certainly be some business models related to that, and by business model, read subsidy. So there are different, but again, two different approaches. So now I've got my electrification including hydrogen, but now I'm adding on some primary fossil fuel, and then for the sake of argument here, I'm talking about natural gas. And so that gives us some of the routes. I can still electrify my end uses, but if I need natural gas as a kind of balancing fuel, because it's to avoid that variability challenge, then I can still burn my natural gas in a normal power plant, but then I've got to have carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization, to mop up the CO2 if I want to do that in a decarbonised way. And the other route, the blue hydrogen route, is simply stripping out the carbon first, and then what you're left with from your natural gas is hydrogen. And then as far as the rest of this picture is concerned, the system then doesn't really care whether it was green, blue, pink, purple, or any other color. Where it came from doesn't matter. It's a hydrogen molecule, and you can do the kind of things that we talked about before. So that's kind of that. Even I wouldn't claim that that's all electrification now. That's about how much do we need to preserve potentially some primary fossil fuel in this story. And of course, the reality is that there's lots of ideas about what the proportions of these different solutions might be. There's lots of argument about them. People often sit in camps where they want everything to be done with CCUS, or they want everything to be done with renewable power and batteries, or they want everything to be done with green hydrogen, or whatever it may be. And the reality, of course, is that in the real world, we're going to be talking about combinations of these things, and it's kind of where the boundaries lie. And that won't be down to single factors. It will be down to multiple factors. It will be down to things like, as I say, not just everyone. We know about variability. That's not a surprise to kind of system planners and that kind of thing. But it's going to be around things like availability of resources, challenges in getting grid built, issues around with hydrogen. There's issues around kind of transporting it and storing it and safety and that kind of stuff. So there's a whole bunch of other factors which will ultimately determine which routes to electrification we end up taking. It won't just be around kind of pure, if you like, purist looks at energy efficiency and so on. Okay, so that's pretty much the 45 minutes. Hopefully giving you a kind of rough overview. I'm not going to read the summary. You'll get the slides. That's just summarizing the stuff that I've talked about. I do need to make the point that, of course, the plug here, if you want to find out more about some of these specific topics, how they fit together, and also individually what they're about. These are all courses that I can train on. So I'm sure Darren, do you want to step in, Darren, at this point?
Yes. Just briefly in terms of the training that we provide. I've sent a link into the chat as well, which goes to our homepage, which covers our topic around energy. We've found in the last 12 months a huge uptake in interest in these courses for obvious reasons. And I think the presentation that you've just given there, John, basically addresses a lot of the big issues, and a lot of the questions we have are quite big questions that we'll have to go through. But the website is a great resource for a lot of information around any relevant training courses. So feel free to go to the website there, and we have a live chat available on the website if people need more information as well. But I think, John, should we crack on with the questions? Because again, we've got a number to go through. And apologies to anybody that we don't address their question, because we've had a good sort of 20 plus questions asked during the presentation.
Okay.
So some of the topics are probably questions, John, that you won't be able to answer in 2 minutes, but we'll give it a go anyway. So
I'll give it a go. I'll just work my way through them, shall I?
Yeah. So
okay. Okay. So I think the first one I answered. So Brian Law, why has the steep decline flattened in the UK for CO2 and electrification slide? I mean, there's probably a whole bunch of factors, but I think one of the key ones is that steep decline in CO2 coincided with a very steep phase out, a very steep reduction in the amount of coal that was being burnt. And that got to, you reach a point, of course, where we pretty much got rid of coal. So I think that to me is why it's flattened out a little bit. We've got rid of the easy stuff, if you like. And so the challenge now is, how do you start to, if you want to keep reducing that, how do you start to phase out natural gas? So I think I mentioned that briefly. Henry Kerr, what has driven the reduction in electricity generation over the years? Reduction of industry. Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few factors. There's energy efficiency, not a very trendy topic. But all those regulations around using LED light bulbs rather than tungsten light bulbs. I mean, if you're using 80% or 90% less electricity per light bulb, if you multiply that by however many light bulbs there are on the country, it starts to add up. I mean, your freezers, all that kind of stuff. So that helps. I think also, I don't know what proportion of that is down to that, but also, yes, industry, less kind of heavy industry, more kind of service-based economy. I don't know what the proportions of that, but I think both of those factors play in. Stanley Rutter, will there ever come a point where we can heat our homes using electric heaters instead of complicated heat pumps? Well, I mean, you can do that now. The difference with, if you mean kind of just resistive electric heaters, is they just use a lot more electricity for the same amount of heat. Heat pumps the reason heat pumps are very efficient is that they use a little bit of electricity to gather a bunch of heat from the environment. So there's no magic. Whereas electric resistive heating, you're turning electricity kind of directly into heat through obviously a resistive wire. So yeah, you could, as I say, you could do that. There are people trying to flog kind of infrared heating panels and that kind of stuff as well. So there are other electric heating options. And yeah, I'm not here to say all one or all the other, but I think your heat pumps will dominate simply because you get more heat for the same amount of electricity that you've paid for. And I think ultimately, hopefully they'll get less complicated. Hopefully they'll get a bit more standardized in terms of installation and that kind of stuff. So, Martin, why isn't tidal power given higher priority, given its more constant potential? Cost is the short answer. I mean, Again, I'm not against tidal power. We've got a great resource here in the UK for tidal power. But the reason it's not been, there's been lots and lots of people looking at prototype tidal power devices, and there was the Swansea tidal project. There's been a whole bunch of proposed tidal things. The reason it's never really got anywhere has been cost. It's just way more expensive way to produce power. But of course, then we get back to then is what's the cost of intermittency, and as you add, if you just keep adding variable resources into the system, the cost of intermittency then start to shoot up. So I think tidal my view would be that I think tidal will play a role, because firstly, if you're looking at security, energy security of supply, that kind of stuff, we've got good resource. It's, as you say, it's a bit, I mean, it's not constant. We have high tide and low tide. There's some clever things you can do with kind of storing between the two, but there is some variability, but it's a more predictable variability. You can look upon an astronomical calculation as to how much energy there'll be at 3 o'clock on a Thursday in 2035 or whatever. But yeah, it's the reason it's not been given high priority is simply the economics, I would say. Come on. With increasing electrification from solar and wind, are there any best practices to manage its intermittency? Well, I mean, I think that's kind of what we were talking about. So they're very different. When people talk about intermittency, it's very important to be clear about what we mean. So solar's intermittency is very different from wind. Solar is a kind of, and it depends where you are in the world. So in some countries where there's not much seasonal difference, solar just kind of bounces up and down every day. We know it's dark at night. We know it's sunniest at noon. There might be some cloud cover imposed on that, but it's a nice regular daily pattern. Even here in the UK, it's a nice regular daily pattern. It's just that there's also a big seasonal difference. And so that, in many ways, that's easier to handle. So you see a lot more solar plus battery projects, for example, than you do solar and wind projects, because if you've got 3-4 hours storage, you can do an awful lot in terms of making solar more useful in the system. You can shift it from the middle of the day to peak time in the evening. Wind is more difficult because of those kind of more irregular patterns, more weather system based patterns where the variability is over kind of hundreds of hours or several days, even weeks in some cases. So yeah, I mean, the best practice depends on the type of system, and it depends on resources you've got. Countries with lots of nice potential pumped hydro resources, of course, could do a lot more with pumped hydro. Whereas if you live in, I don't know, if you live in the Netherlands, that's never going to be such a big deal. So best practice depends on what resources you have, understanding the variability in that particular country, and then also what storage resources you potentially have. Martin, what's complicated about heat pump? Oh, I think that's probably in response to the previous question rather than for me. Henry, is the battery growth only grid level storage or total? So that was stationary storage. So it wasn't including cars, it wasn't including EVs, the chart. It would include what they call kind of behind the meter small scale and utility scale, I believe. I think it covered both, but it wouldn't include EVs. EVs is going to be much, much bigger. I mean, if you look at the scale of battery store capacity that's going to be embodied in cars is going to be huge compared to stationary, which is why things like using batteries connected to the grid, things like vehicle to grid, those kind of things are potentially so disruptive in future, because if you've got this huge capacity of batteries, which is embodied in cars, and in most cars, certainly private vehicles, spend 90% of their time parked somewhere where they could be plugged in, that's potentially a huge resource that you could use as well. Plans for end of battery life management. So there's a few things. There's quite a lot of work and quite a lot of projects looking at second life usage, particularly batteries coming out of cars. because degradation in a car is obviously, say you lose kind of 10% of your capacity or 15% of your capacity in a car, that makes quite a big difference because you can't go as far. But it still means you've got a perfectly usable battery that you could put in a stationary application. So there's already a whole bunch of projects out there where they're using second life batteries, taking them out of cars, giving them a second life in stationary applications. And beyond that, of course, it's recycling and proper disposal. And as I say, that to me is a regulatory issue more than there's no theoretical reason why you can't reuse and recycle and dispose of these things properly, but it's industry willingness and regulatory kind of stick, I suppose, to do that. Is it sensible to invest in wind and solar and required storage, or invest in baseload nuclear power? Yeah, I mean, nuclear is always a whole other interesting kind of topic. I mean, I would include nuclear in terms of my kind of low carbon generation. So I'm certainly not, even though I drew a picture of a wind turbine. Nuclear, of course. So I mean, the whole, yeah, that's probably you end up with a very long answer. I mean, whether baseload, even the usefulness of baseload is much debated. On the one hand, you can argue, yeah, it's good to have a nice steady source of supply, and then you need less to kind of mix on top of that. But nuclear also has its inherent kind of inflexibilities. From a technical point of view, you can do things to turn nuclear up and down, but you certainly don't want to. And particularly economically, you don't want to, because you've spent whatever it is now, current bill, kind of £30 billion building it, and you need to get that money back. So you want to run steadily, and that, in some ways, that has inherent inflexibilities in the same way that something that is kind of bouncing up and down has inflexibilities. So actually, things like storage and hydrogen production, there's lots of interest in hydrogen production from nuclear power plants, because those same solutions can actually add flexibility to nuclear in the same way that they add flexibility to renewables. Looking at chart of projected battery growth, demand for blah, blah, blah. How is the mining process and the energy used in mining taken into account? So that would, yeah. So when people are doing all these kind of net zero scenarios and so on, I mean, those, if they're done properly, they take into account energy growth, and that would include energy growth associated with mining. I mean, I can't speak for different particular calculations as to how they all do take that into account, but you could take those, you'd look at what's the energy currently used in mining, and you could just simply you could look at how much energy goes into mining a ton of lithium or a ton of nickel, and as the growth of those goes up, you just incorporate that energy growth from mining into that same calculation. So it does happen, but for example, I couldn't speak for particular scenarios. Are large-scale hydrogen fuel cells an option for converting hydrogen back to electricity? Yeah, so fuel cells, yeah, you can produce electricity. It's the large-scale bit, because fuel cell, it's a bit like battery versus large-scale storage of fuel in a salt cavern. Fuel cells are like batteries; they're kind of modular. If you want large scale, you have to stack up lots and lots and lots and lots of fuel cells, and the cost, it sort of becomes a kind of linear cost stack up. Whereas dissolving a bigger salt cavern out the ground is not, compared to a small one, is not a linear growth. So you can the scale of the cost of storage goes up. The same with, and so when you get to large scale, it's likely that going through a kind of turbine route is going to be more scalable than through a fuel cell route. Again, that's a very quick answer to. Again, there's more behind that question. Richard Downs, think of hydrogen production and subproducts. Are there plans to utilize hydrogen as ammonia in power plants? Yep, in Japan, they've already been testing 20% ammonia with coal co-firing. They've got plans to roll that out quite widely. South Korea, same. They're probably the two main markets looking at ammonia as in power. So I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. We're getting through a few of them. How efficient is the green energy to hydrogen to electricity process? So electricity to hydrogen, you're probably losing about 30% of your energy you started with. Hydrogen back to electricity, if you're in the kind of most efficient combined cycle power plant, or if you're going through a fuel cell, you're losing another kind of 40%. So end to end, you're probably, if you're going from renewables through to hydrogen back to electricity, and you also had a few losses for things like compression and storage along the way, you're probably down at kind of, I don't know, 30%, 35% at best kind of efficiency. So it's not the most efficient way to do it. But again, it's at what point does the efficiency get outweighed by the, in particular, capital cost of building a bigger storage facility? How will hydrogen be moved around? That's a whole 2-day course. Quick plug. Do we need lots of pipelines? Does it need to be compressed? Yes, answer to both of those. Not that there's lots of debate how many new pipelines we need, and how many we can kind of repurpose from natural gas pipelines, for example, but compression certainly. Benjamin, is the ability to transform or refurbish the existing gas network to carry hydrogen? And that, again, that's the same as the previous question, really. Lots of debate around what you might have to do to the existing natural gas network, which pipes are suitable, which aren't. It varies from country to country. It depends on where you are in the network and pressure and all sorts of other factors. So it's the gas network people will tell you it can be done and not at huge cost. Lots of other people will raise issues around kind of safety and that kind of stuff. So it's ongoing debate. Would more and more distributed offshore wind turbines close the variability gap? I think if I read the question correctly, so if you spread your offshore wind more widely, then that does reduce the variability. So if you've got more geographical variation of where you site things, it does reduce the variability. But you can still get periods when you just get a lump of high pressure sitting over the country and wind speeds are kind of low everywhere. So yeah, more wide distribution does help with variability. It's not a complete solution. I'm happy to keep going. If I know we've overrun slightly, but I'm happy to answer some more. It was reported recently that current annual UK energy transport gas grid moved 5 times more energy than the electricity grid. Surely this energy capacity will never be moved from the pipes to the cables. So yeah, and that's because of heating. That's because we use a lot of energy for heating, particularly in the winter, and that it sort of goes back to the heat pump question. You'd certainly need to move more electricity if you electrified heating, but you wouldn't need to match that 5 times, because with heat pumps these days you can get kind of the performance ratio is up at kind of, well, even in cold weather you're probably talking a kind of 2 to 3 maybe ratio between the heat you get out and the electricity you put in. So we wouldn't need to be moving that same multiple on the electricity grid as we did with gas grid. And that's, again, it's back to this, the part of the kind of efficiency of electrification argument. Peter, as engineers, we have risk assessment hammered into us. My domestic supplies, no gas supply interruption over 40 years. Electricity goes off at least 4 times a year. Yeah, I mean, and that's an important part of the whole grid thing. That's why anyone that tells you you can do all this with the current grid is slightly balking mad. There's issues around certainly capacity and capacity augmentation, in certain parts of the country. There might be issues around reliability and so on as well. So yeah, that becomes part of it. I mean, that's where, of course, having more distributed storage and more local storage comes into play as well. So The question: do we want 100% electricity supply? Then we're back to that point. Well, maybe it won't be 100% electricity supply. Maybe it's not pure electrification. It's electrification plus some other. There's still going to be some fuels in that mix as well. There was a report out before I forget. There was a report out just yesterday, actually, from the Climate Change Committee, looking at the UK and how the UK could decarbonize electricity supply in particular, and they certainly weren't looking at. They were including. It wasn't all just kind of that pure electrification. It wasn't just kind of wind and batteries. It was they found with lots of detailed modelling that you'd certainly have to include either hydrogen or natural gas with carbon capture and storage and various other things as well. If the UK completely decarbonises, will it actually have a meaningful impact with China? Again, we're into kind of different discussion, really. Again, there was a stat I saw the other day where if you add up all the countries where it's 2% or less or whatever of global emissions, it adds up to something like 40%. It adds up to a much bigger number than China. So it's that argument that, well, if everyone says, well, we won't bother until China does, then there's a huge chunk of emissions that don't get reduced. And it's also assuming that China's not doing anything, which I just don't think is the case. But that's probably a different discussion. Well, I know it's not the case because you just have to look at how much clean energy they're building. Is the prospect of using hydrogen for domestic heating realistic? Yeah, that's a very fraught debate. I'm not a big fan of hydrogen for domestic heating, I have to be honest. It just seems like a rather a very inefficient way to do it. But again, I never want to kind of rule things out. I'm always very dubious about kind of one size fits all. I think the reality is that most people will choose to electrify because it will be the most cost-effective way for them to do that. But I wouldn't rule out the idea of any domestic heating continuing to use boilers. But there's so many things when you look at kind of the efficiency side of it, the implementation side of it, and some of the complexities there in terms of equipment and rollout and safety issues and that kind of stuff. I can see why the gas are keen to push it. I'm not a big fan, but as I say, I'm not claiming to have a crystal ball on all this stuff. Do I see a future for small modular reactors? Assuming that's what you mean. Yes. Short and sweet answer. Yeah, I do actually. I think there's obviously a big hurdles to get through to get them off the ground. The kind of long-term promise, if you like, is nuclear, which is cheaper, but also it's not just the cheaper bit, it's quicker. I mean, deployment of building huge customized one-off power plants is just proving to be problematic, an understatement. So I think there's lots going for the idea of, if you want nuclear still in the mix, of going through an SMR route. So yeah, I don't think it'll be quick. I think I can't remember what the latest kind of Rolls-Royce numbers we're talking about. I think we're probably talking about 2030-ish for the first kind of demo project deployments. So it's kind of, but as a long-term thing, yep, I would. Fusion, no idea when it becomes a viable energy solution. I mean, decades and decades. It might become, again, that's the difference. If you're talking about viable as in a commercial, repeatable rollout, yeah, I probably beyond my lifetime, I would say. But again, I mean, let's wait and see. Is there an issue with battery storage in terms of battery life and combustion? So issues with degradation. Yeah, again, that's when we get into lots of other types of battery chemistry. So conventional lithium-ion batteries, we all know that they degrade and they start to lose capacity. So they're a lot better. The management of them has got to much better lifespans now, and also different chemistries degrade far less. So, and the same with fire risk, thermal runaway. It's dependent on the type of battery chemistry. Even when people talk about lithium-ion batteries covers lots and lots of different chemistry types. So, yeah. Would more larger interconnectors help? Yes. Yeah, all in favour of that as well. Would this be more worthwhile compared to distributed grid investment? So I don't think it's. Yeah, I don't think it's one or the other. You're always going to have kind of last mile distributed grid, but interconnection certainly helps in terms of not having to do all the balancing just in your one area. There will always be an extent to which you can kind of, if you've got a bigger area to balance across. I mean, it's a bit like having your offshore wind farms more spread out. If your demand is also more spread out over a bigger area, it just gives you more. You've just got more sources of supply and more sources of demand that you can start to smooth out. Is it more cost effective to develop renewables than carbon capture? Yeah, almost certainly. Just been logged out. I think we're nearly at the end. Should there be a focus on localized energy production for industry to reduce the reliance on the grid, e.g. solar on factories or turbines? Yeah, I mean, again, that's kind of to some extent we're kind of back to. I think there should be, and I think we're seeing that anyway, where it's cost effective to do. We get back to the and some companies do that to be less dependent on the grid as well, and it certainly takes pressure off the grid in terms of having to import huge amounts if you can generate more of it locally. So I think I don't. To my mind, that's not. I think we're beyond the case where we need to particularly focus and try and kind of force that to happen. We're at the stage with things like solar now. You don't need to subsidise solar. It's something that companies kind of make their own. They're starting to make their own choices and so on anyway. So I think that will happen. If that makes sense. Would ammonia storage enable more energy to be stored? Gas grid. Yeah, I mean, ammonia is more energy dense. I don't think I've not heard anyone seriously talking about ammonia in the gas grid. UK energy dependency. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of being completely energy independent anytime soon is probably a way off. Even if you're independent in terms of fuels, we go back to mining and we go back to natural resources. I mean, that's the can countries kind of hunker down within their own borders and just do everything internally versus kind of what extent is globalization helpful? So I think there's obviously a trend and a desire politically towards more energy independence, but I think there's a perfectly reasonable argument that trying to be completely energy independent would end up being way more expensive than having some kind of supply chain dependencies on other partners. But choices of who those partners are is certainly kind of big political issue at the moment. I think we're nearly there. How much of these barriers are technological, grid level, mass market scalability, and how many are economic or regulatory? Given the privatisation of the UK grid, is regulation the biggest hurdle? So, yeah, I mean, regulation and politics, you can never separate it from energy. There's some of the barriers are technological, so it's both. I would say technology always moves on, and humans are just very good at finding technical solutions to problems that exist. As long as there is the regulatory environment that helps them grow, and often to do that, helping them grow is about, at first, anything new that comes out expensive. I'm pretty much. There's probably examples of where you could, I'm sure someone could come up with an example where that's not quite true, but as a general kind of theme, new technologies that come out, whether it be mobile phones or or electric vehicles or laptops or whatever it is throughout history, they come out, they're more expensive. Technology drives those costs down as the scale of the market improves. And so the role of regulation is, I would say, it's around kind of fostering an environment in which those things can grow. And that's, I know it's been true in the past. Things like, I mean, oil and gas in the past was all kind of state funded and state subsidized in that respect. So this isn't something that's kind of true just of kind of new technologies. So I think it's economics and regulations are kind of the primary drivers, if you like. The technology development will always happen. Technologies will always prove, but the kind of barrier to market, if you like, is almost always economic and regulatory. And then I think is it the last one? There's more popping up. I'm going to do the last two and then we'll stop, shall we? How would the cost compare for improving the grid to handle more power compared with putting solar and battery in every home? Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I suspect, yeah, I don't know. I've not seen that calculation done. I suspect improving the grid would be, I suspect it would be cheaper. The cost of putting solar and battery in every home, and again, in a country like the UK, it could never be one or the other, because I mean, I've got solar on the roof, and I know in the winter, the difference between winter and summer is enormous. I'll have enough in the winter, I'll have too much in the summer. So there's always going to be the need for grid to do some of the balancing if you're just looking at solar and battery, but that may be different in other countries where you've not got the seasonal issue. I suspect. So yeah, but I suspect. Yeah, it's one of those not either or questions. I think you're going to have to. I think solar and battery, people kind of do that depending on the circumstance. You can't put it in every home anyway because of people living in apartments and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I wouldn't use that as a kind of get out of jail card for not spending on the grid, put it that way. And then the last one, should not be more important as a task to reduce to zero the current usage of fossil fuels before having electric cars. Imagine having all cars electric will push the build and run double amount of power plants running fossil fuels. So let me try and understand the question. So if you've not got electric cars, then you're using fossil fuels in cars. I'm assuming you mean fossil fuels from the electricity system. So if the question is, should we not completely decarbonize the electricity system from fossil fuels before having electric cars? Not necessarily. Again, we're back to what has the biggest impact on, I mean, depends what your motivation is, but if you're looking at what has the biggest impact on things like carbon reduction, for example, electrification of cars is actually very, again, that came out in the Climate Change Committee report yesterday. There's a chart in there somewhere that showing what has the most impact on carbon reduction, and electrifying cars is right over there on the one of the kind of highest impacts, because if you're burning oil in a car, that's actually, in terms of emissions per unit of energy used, that's actually quite a highly emitting thing. So yeah, with all these things, I don't think it's never a case of waiting for one thing to happen before starting the other. I think things are just going to naturally have to happen in parallel. Also, I'll disagree with the second point. You can do the sums on if all cars go electric, it doesn't double the amount of electricity generation you require. If you were to electrify all the cars in the UK, the number you end up with, you're probably looking at more, something like 25-30% increase in electricity generation over and above the kind of current baseline demand. It's not as big a number as people think. I mean, it's still quite a substantial increase, but you're not doubling or tripling the demand for electricity. That's a bit of a kind of media myth. If you actually run the numbers of how much electricity EVs use and the distances that people travel in them and that kind of stuff, you're adding, as I say, something like kind of round about 30%. And I've seen the same calculations in different countries generally come out somewhere between kind of 25 and 40% as the increase in electricity demand you need to kind of electrify a fleet of cars. Okay, I think I've gone through them all. So
yep, well done, John. Yeah, most people hung around for the additional questions, which is always encouraging.
Okay,
so yeah, just to say thank you for everybody who joined us today. Kind of a virtual round of applause for John for doing the extra shift there for us. As I said, the website is a great point of resource for information around these topics. There's a link in the chat, and again, in terms of the slides, they will be provided to anyone who's signed in, and it will also be available on our YouTube channel, where there's the ability to catch up on similar presentations that have been hosted through the webinars as well. So just a big thank you to John, and thank you everyone who's attended today, and have a nice weekend. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks everyone.